In the candlelit stillness of an underground monastery, tucked beneath the soft stone valleys of Cappadocia, a monk stirred his brew in total silence. No chants, no clinking. Just the gentle hiss of steam rising from a clay vat and the faint crackle of fire behind him. He had taken a vow of silence, not out of solemn duty, but because the yeast, he swore, preferred it that way. This is the forgotten tale of how ancient monks perfected their beer, not with noise or fanfare, but with quiet, patience, and an almost sacred hush. So settle in, let the world fade, and join us as we drift gently into the quiet ferment of a time when even the bubbles dared not burst too loudly. Chapter 1. Silence in the Stone Valleys. It is morning in Cappadocia, sometime in the 9th century. The sun has just begun to bleed its amber warmth into the soft rippled stone of the Anatolian valleys. Dust from the carved footpaths stirs gently in the air. And somewhere, deep within the porous tough rock of a hollowed-out cave monastery, a bell chimes, a low, resonant sound. The kind of sound you feel more than hear, and yet no one speaks. Is not a place of conversation. The monks of this hidden Byzantine community, nestled among honeycombed cliffs and sun-baked caves, had taken vows of near-complete silence. Not out of drama, not out of mysticism, but because they believed words interrupted divine contemplation. Silence, they said, made the beer taste better. You, dear listener, might raise an eyebrow at that last part. Beer? In a monastery? In the Byzantine Empire? And brewed silently? Yes, and not just any beer, but beer meticulously crafted by candlelight. And prayer, without a single spoken word from start to finish. Over centuries, this unusual method became more than just tradition. It became their theology in practice. To begin understanding why, we must go backward, not just through the monastery corridors, but through centuries of forgotten fermentation and faithful repetition. A land of strange stone and strange solitude, Cappadocia was not an obvious place to brew anything. The terrain is dramatic. Cliffs, pinnacles, and valleys formed from the volcanic ash and wind erosion of long-extinct volcanoes. From above, it looks like a dreamscape sculpted by wind and time. But for Byzantine monks, its isolation made it perfect. These communities began to appear in earnest in the 4th and 5th centuries, as Christian monasticism took hold. Over time, they developed elaborate cave complexes, chapels, kitchens, libraries, all tunneled into the soft volcanic rock. These weren't just caves. They were entire underground cities of devotion. Many of these monks followed the teachings of Basil of Caesarea, Saint Basil, who emphasized manual labor, asceticism, and humility. Brewing beer, at least in the early days, was not an indulgence. It was necessity. Wine, the drink of liturgy, was expensive and regionally inconsistent. Beer, on the other hand, could be made quietly with local grains and herbs, a humble beverage that required patience, observation, and silence. And it is that silence, more than the grains, that made Cappadocian monastic beer unique. Brewing by gesture, the language of monastic fermentation. To brew beer in silence was no easy task. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the monastery's narrow brew chamber, a room cut into the rock, dimly lit by a single beeswax candle resting on a cracked stone ledge. Around you, clay. Amphorae sit in various stages of fermentation. The smell is earthy, damp yeast, grain, and faint bitterness. The monks move around you, clad in dark robes tied with coarse rope. No one speaks. Instead, they communicate with simple gestures. Over time, they developed what was essentially a brewing sign language. One finger drawn in a circle meant begin the boil. 3 taps on the wooden vat meant stir the wort. A hand gently hovering over the surface of a ceramic pot indicated watch the bubbles. They relied on rhythm. The boil was timed with psalm recitations, not out loud, but silently in the mind. One full Psalm 119, which conveniently is the longest in the Bible, equaled the right steeping time for their barley mash. Yeast, of course, was wild, captured by leaving open jars near the stone windows. And without words to describe when it was ready, the monks trained their noses and eyes. The tiniest change in scent or surface texture was enough. They became connoisseurs of silence, able to read a fermentation's progress like scripture, mistakes. When they happened, were not scolded, but silently acknowledged. A monk who scorched the wort might spend the next morning cleaning every amphora with mountain ash and snowmelt water in penance. Why silence? The silence wasn't just an accident. Of devotion. These monks believed that the act of brewing was a form of prayer, and that silence allowed them to hear what God might be saying through the smallest bubbling pot or the scent of barley steam. There's a famous apocryphal saying attributed to an unknown Cappadocian monk: "The beer will not bless the tongue that talks too much." While this wasn't doctrine, it represented a belief shared by many monastic orders that spiritual labor and physical labor were not separate things. Brewing beer could be holy if done with humility, reverence, and quiet. What makes this even more curious is how central this beverage became to the monastery's identity. Despite the restrictions, or perhaps because of them, the beer of these silent monks began to spread. Nearby villages spoke, often in whispers, of the beer that speaks through dreams. Said to bring clarity and calm. It's unlikely it did anything mystical. But what is likely is this: that centuries before modern brewing science, a group of men in candlelit caves, bound by silence and discipline, created a recipe so precise it didn't require words, and yet we know so little today. Little of this. Beer survives. The recipe, if it ever existed in full, was never written down. Byzantine brewing was rarely recorded. Unlike their Western counterparts in Ireland or Germany, Eastern monks did not memorialize their beer in illuminated manuscripts. They preferred that the knowledge pass hand to hand, monk to monk, breath to breath, though never in speech. Some fragments remain, scraps of text referencing the bitter blessing, or grains made holy by quiet fire. But mostly, what we know comes from archaeology and hints: scorch marks in brewing chambers, residues on clay jars, and the occasional marginalia note from a curious traveler. Why did this brewing method fade? Was it replaced by louder, more efficient traditions? Did the silence become impractical in a louder world? Or perhaps, did the monks believe that in silence, the soul learned what even the finest recipe could not teach? Chapter 2. Clay vessels and candle smoke, the tools of silent brewing. Let's step deeper into the monastery now, past the chapel, past the scriptorium with its faint smell of old parchment and beeswax ink, and into the rock-hewn heart of the brewing chamber. It is not large, perhaps no larger than a modest stable, but it is perfectly cool, even in the summer. And entirely silent, save for the occasional sound of liquid dripping, slow, methodical, from clay to clay. In this second chamber, we begin to understand not just what the monks did, but how they did it. No copper kettles, no metal spigots, no wooden barrels braced with iron hoops. Their brewing tools were quiet, natural, and local, chosen specifically so that nothing would clang or disrupt the stillness. Even the ladles were carved wood, worn smooth over decades of gentle stirring, clay amphorae, and the taste of stone. The core of Cappadocian brewing was the amphora tall, narrow-mouthed jars made from local clay, fired slowly to preserve their porous texture. Each jar was etched with a small marking at the base, a crescent for barley brews, a circle for millet, and a vertical line for experimental blends with honey or fruit peel. Unlike modern containers, these amphorae breathed. Their porous walls allowed a gentle exchange of air, and sometimes even helped capture wild yeast from the air of the cave itself. Fermentation, in this context, was not tightly controlled. It was observed like a sunrise. The monks did not aim for identical batches, only for right enough. They believed that good beer, like good prayer, did not require perfection, only sincerity and patience over time. These jars developed a patina, a reddish-black film on the inside from years of wort and steam. This was never scrubbed away. In fact, it was revered. It was called the ghost root, and older monks would tap the sides of the jar with a hollow reed, listening for the difference in tone. If the vessel rang high and clean, it was healthy. If it thudded flat, it was retired, sometimes repurposed into a planter for bitter herbs or fig saplings. Brewing ingredients: local, humble, and sometimes strange. The grains used were simple. Barley was the most common, but millet, emmer wheat, and occasionally cracked lentils were added for texture. There were no imported hops. This was the Byzantine East, after all. But instead, bittering agents came from local herbs: wormwood, wild thyme, coriander, and a curious pale blue flower called asiaska, which bloomed only for a few weeks each spring and gave the brew a slightly herbal coolness. Water came from underground cisterns dug into the soft stone, always cold, always still. Fire was used sparingly. In fact, part of the silence involved the monks training themselves to manage temperature by hand. They would place their palms on the side of a clay pot and hum silently, not in voice, but in breath. If they could feel warmth through 3 slow inhalations, the mash was ready. Too soon, and it was too hot. Too late, and it was too cold. They had no thermometers, but they had time. And stillness, candlelight as a tool. The only light allowed during brewing was from beeswax candles. These were not just for illumination. They were tools, used for timing, for mood, and for reverence. One candle, carefully measured, would burn for just about the length needed to steep the grain. Another, shorter one, was used to time cooling. When the monks began a new brew, they often started by lighting 3 candles in a row, one for the earth, one for the grain, one for the quiet. When the flames flickered together, it meant that the air was right, still enough, calm enough. Brewing began. Some younger monks, new to the order, struggled with this. A sudden cough, a dropped reed spoon, even the accidental clang of a clay jug could earn a week of dish-scraping duties. Not as punishment, but as recentering. Noise was not sin, but a kind of imbalance. A disruption of the sacred echo that lived in those caves, shared labor, shared prayer. It's worth pausing here to think about what it must have felt like, day after day, year after year, to brew beer in this way. No one shouted instructions. No one asked what came next. Everything was done by rhythm, repetition, and quiet glances. A raised brow meant, "Do we cool now?" A nod meant yes. A tap of 3 fingers on the table, "Taste this." And when the final amphora was sealed, and the brew left to ferment in the cool shadow of the cave walls, the monks gathered in silence. A single candle was placed in the center of the floor, and each monk passed by it, tracing a small circle in the air, not a blessing in the traditional sense, but a gesture of intention. They did not ask for the beer to be good. They asked only that it be enough, enough to nourish the body, enough to share, enough to remember the labor of quiet hands. A recipe etched only in memory. No one wrote it down. There's no parchment in any Byzantine archive with the proportions of grain, the sequence of steeping, or the ideal fermentation time. There are no scrolls, no scroll margins filled with brewers' notes. All that knowledge was lived. And when a monk died, his brewing wisdom passed to the next in a series of wordless days, hand motions, and countless hours standing beside bubbling clay jars. This wasn't inefficient, it was deliberate. The act of brewing, passed silently, became a thread in the monastery's fabric, like sweeping or praying or washing the feet of strangers. And perhaps that's the heart of it. The Cappadocian monks didn't just brew beer, they brewed memory, in silence, in light, in patience. Chapter 3. The Quiet Ferment. How monks in Cappadocia perfected beer without saying a word. By the time the Cappadocian monks reached the 9th century, Their way of brewing had achieved an almost sacred regularity, not because they had access to superior ingredients, or because they had unlocked some arcane technique hidden from the rest of the empire, but because, quite simply, they had been listening, not with ears, but with eyes, hands, and the slow rhythm of lived repetition. They brewed beer as they did everything else in their rock-hewn monastery, with silence, care, and devotion in the cool, subterranean fermenting chambers beneath their living quarters, barely taller than a man. The stone walls had been darkened by years of smoke, barley steam, and flickering torchlight. Here, the final process of fermentation occurred. Clay amphorae lined the curved edges of the chamber, each sealed not with corks or wax, but a carefully tied cloth weighted with small river stones. These vessels were not labeled. There were no tags, dates, or even carved notches. The monks did not mark time as merchants or vintners did. They marked it with patience. Instead, each vessel's readiness was measured through experience. The soft bubbling of fermentation could be heard faintly. If one leaned close, a gentle hiss like a distant pot of soup. The color of the cloth, damp from escaping vapor, told its own story. The senior brewing monk, often called the Watcher, would move from amphora to amphora, eyes half closed, feeling the temperature of each vessel with the back of his hand, though. The monastery practiced silence. There were ways of communicating essential information. Among the monks, a subtle nod, a hand signal, or a slight lift of the brow was often enough to say, "That batch is almost ready," or "Leave that vessel another day." Their beer, not the golden bubbly drink we know today, was thick, slightly sour, and filled with grainy particulates. It resembled a thin porridge more than a drink, often consumed with a spoon or ladled into shallow wooden bowls. And yet, it was nourishing. It offered sustenance to fasting monks who consumed no solid food for days, and it provided enough calories to survive Cappadocia's dry winters without hunting or trade. Though never intended for commercial use, word of their brew eventually leaked, slowly, as rumors do. Pilgrims from across the empire who stayed in the outer cells of the monastery spoke of the bread in a bowl that revived them after long journeys. Some called it liquid humility. Others, more humorously, referred to it as monks. Breakfast. Still, the monks did not capitalize on this fame. They brewed for themselves and for those in need. Extra beer was sometimes poured into small jugs and left at the entrance of the monastery for travelers to take freely. No coins were accepted. No thanks were required. A silent act of hospitality, echoing their rule. One might wonder how they managed to improve the recipe over time without ever discussing it aloud. The answer lay in their method. Each monk was expected to apprentice for years beneath a master brewer. During those years, the novice spoke no words of enquiry. He simply watched, mimicked, failed, adjusted. He learned by smell, the sharp bite of overly heated mash, the sweet hint of successful malt. He learned by texture, how the soaked barley should feel between his fingers, how much water was too much. And above all, he learned by trust. Trust that the work would teach him, that silence had its own way of revealing knowledge. The monastery's quiet life was not without risk. Brewing required grain, and grain required trade or storage. Though the monks grew a portion of their own barley in nearby terraces, most of their stock was received from neighboring farmers in exchange for beer or other services, written letters, prayers for the dead, or mended tools. This delicate relationship with the outside world had to be managed carefully. They appointed one monk, known as the Silent Steward, to handle these affairs. He was permitted to speak, only outside the monastery walls, and only in necessity. It was the Silent Steward who first recorded an early written account of the brewing practice, preserved today in a faded manuscript stored at a museum in Istanbul. In the margin, he noted, "They brew as they pray, without demand, without pride. It is not the drink, but the doing that nourishes the soul." But even silence cannot shield one from history. By the late 10th century, the political winds of Byzantium shifted. Cappadocia's valleys became less safe. Raiders passed through more frequently. Some monasteries were sacked, others abandoned. Yet, the monastery where the silent beer had been perfected endured. At least for a time, it is said that during one particularly brutal winter, a group of soldiers sought refuge there, half-starved, their armor frozen stiff. The monks offered them hot beer, stale bread, and straw bedding. They asked for nothing in return. The soldiers, bewildered by the lack of interrogation or ceremony, spent the night in silence themselves, speaking in whispers as if the monastery's hush had spread to them. One soldier, decades later, would tell his son, "They fed me without asking my name. Their beer warmed my stomach more than any fire. I could not tell if they were holy men or ghosts." By the 12th century, as the empire fractured and trade routes changed, the beer-brewing monks began to vanish. Whether from famine, assimilation, or quiet retreat, their presence faded. But, curiously, fragments of their techniques survived in odd places in northern Greece. Some monasteries began fermenting grains in sealed ceramic pots, mimicking Cappadocian vessels. In Armenia, a monastic recipe refers to a grain drink kept quiet in darkness. And in early Slavic brewing traditions, some brewers still refer to an old rule, the belief that beer ferments better when spoken over less. Today, modern historians still puzzle over just how the monks achieved a stable brew without yeast cultivation or thermometers. But perhaps the question misses the point. They were not trying to master beer. They were mastering patience. Their legacy is not measured in recipes or foam heads, but in rhythm, a quiet rhythm of movement and care, repeated each day without applause. If one visits the Green Valley now, where their caves still pock the soft rock, one finds silence of a different kind. Not monastic, but historical. A silence of time past. The brewing chambers are empty. The amphorae long gone. And yet, if you stand in the old kitchens as dusk settles and wind whispers through the tunneled halls, you might imagine them still moving about, slow, careful, with the quiet dignity of men who brewed not for wealth or fame, but because it was needed. Their story is not written in grand tomes or etched in mosaic. It is held in memory, in silence, and if you're lucky, in a faint echo of barley and warmth. And so we end this quiet ferment, not with a bang, but a hush. A whispered thanks to those who brewed by candlelight and never raised their voices, only their bowls. Thank you for joining us in this quiet corner of history, where even the beer was brewed in silence. If you enjoyed this gentle journey through time, please consider supporting the channel by giving this video a like, sharing it with someone who could use a calm story, and subscribing to Quiet Boring Sleep for more slow, soothing tales from the past. Until next time, may your evenings be peaceful, your sleep uninterrupted, and your history wonderfully boring.